Stories of trauma and survival, and now a federal investigation overseen by the nation's first Native American cabinet secretary. As land acknowledgements are gaining popularity, honoring the ones who inhabited the land long before colonization, how the Ohio State University is expanding on that practice. Those stories and more tonight on this special edition of Front Row, A Turning Point. Welcome in to this special edition of Front Row, A Turning Point. I'm Sarah Shookman.
And I'm Lena Lai. November is Native American Heritage Month, and today's show will look at the past, present, and future of Native Americans and the struggles they've endured both here in Northeast Ohio and beyond.
And we begin tonight with the Native American Urban Relocation Program. It changed the face of cities across the country as well as Native American culture. Leon Bibb shares details on the movement, which first started at an historic Ohio City church, and the legacy that continues to be felt across the land.
The old building in Cleveland stands not only as a worship place for a congregation which meets here, but it also is a historical structure where many significant turning points in the lives of people seeking new ways of life unfolded. When early 19th century stones were cemented into place, founders of the Cleveland Near West Side's St. John's Episcopal Church could have no thought of the role the building would play in the lives of American Indians more than a century later. Marie Toledo is a member of the Lake Erie Native American Council, a local group working to preserve Native American culture. In 1969, she was in the church building when it hosted Native American activist Russell Means, who led the formation of what would become the Cleveland American Indian Center.
Their point in that was to have Native people literally absorbed into the melting pot and reservations gone, Indigenous people eradicated as we know it.
Cleveland was one of 8 relocation centers offering employment opportunities for Native Americans. The center here was designed to help Indians in an urban environment, but with the center, there were problems, internal and external. Many things envisioned did not take place. In 1995, it closed. Today, Marie Toledo says the members of the Lake Erie Native American Council try to pick up where the earlier center left off. It also works to educate the public on the fact that Indians are not a monolithic group, but comprised of many tribes.
Understanding other tribes, because we can be very different.
Some figures place population of Native Americans in Northeast Ohio at 5,000. Toledo was born and raised in Cleveland and ties her ancestry to the Pueblo people of the southwestern United States.
The Pueblo people are the oldest known inhabitants on this continent. We're ancient people.
In the final days of the 60s and into the 70s, the lives of Native American tribes were discussed in the old church building, where the Cleveland American Indian Center was formed. Since the church's formation in the 1830s, St. John's Episcopal has helped racial minorities at many turning points in their lives.
If this building could talk, the stories that it would tell. You know, there's a tie between Native Americans who met in this building and also runaway black slaves from the American Confederacy. Just as this building was the first American Indian Center in Cleveland, it was also a stop 100 years before on the Underground Railroad.
Generations later, Marie Toledo and the Lake Erie Native American Council tell the stories not only for the rest of America, but also
for ourselves and for our children, sharing it within our Native community, our Indigenous community, and outside there.
A turning point. For 3 News, I'm Leon Bibb.
This Thanksgiving will mark 400 years since the first between the Pilgrims and the Native Americans. But over that time, historians say the story of what actually happened between the two groups has changed and has been misrepresented. Now, as Maureen Kyle reports, there is a spark of change in schools around the country to teach our kids the true history of Thanksgiving.
We were just, as Native people and Native history and Native culture, really small snippets of our history are in textbooks or are in teaching.
As an educator, Dr. Star Yellowfish noticed the history of her ancestors was glossed over in the classroom. Just a paragraph about natives in Oklahoma, when she says Oklahoma could be an entire state of natives in of itself, and not just glossed over, but stereotyped in an archaic way.
And I say archaic because it's 2021. I say archaic because you have lessons that were being taught to our parents and grandparents still being taught to kindergartners and third graders, and was, paper feathers and brown paper sacks, and let's dress you up like an Indian and a pilgrim, when they weren't even really Indians or pilgrims. They were the English and the Wampanoag.
So she, along with other educators in the Native American Student Services Department, came up with a suggested lesson plan.
The pamphlet contains facts like how Tisquantum, a member of the Wampanoag tribe, became fluent in English, became an interpreter, and taught the English to grow corn. And then there's the Treaty of Friendship signed by the Wampanoag chief, giving the English 12,000 acres of land to occupy. And that first meal, well, there wasn't any turkey. The Wampanoag men contributed 5 deer. They had a 3-day feast and engaged in diplomacy. There were 90 Native men sharing their food with 50 Englishmen.
This is a lesson that's, across the globe that people think about, and we want them to think about Native American peoples as helping and as, not so much the negative story that's been told for centuries, but, really helping out the country and the people that were here.
For regions like ours that have deep Native American veins like the Cuyahoga running through them, these women hope that teachers here use our land to teach about our past.
At the very least, teachers can acknowledge that where we live and where we have our community was originally from this tribe. And did you know that this town or this river or this location was named for this? And the reason they did that, even having those 3 things would be influential, I think, in young people's lives.
We were in touch with the Ohio State Board of Education, which told us that local schools and districts have sole authority for adopting curriculum. We reached out to several school districts to ask if they were teaching any of these talking points sketched out by Oklahoma City schools, but we did not hear back. But if your child's school is like mine, I've seen some efforts to teach about the different tribes. The point Dr. Yellowfish is making is that we can all do better. Maureen Kyle, 3 News.
The National Congress of American Indians reports Ohio has the most schools with Native American mascots of any state. Research from the Ohio High School Athletic Association shows that includes 78 high schools. This past August, the Cuyahoga Heights High School district voted unanimously to retire the district's controversial sports team name, the same one that the Washington football team stopped using last year. The name was immediately removed along with the team's logo. Now going by the nickname Heights, the district has not voted on a formal replacement. In light of the Cleveland Guardians name change, 2 Democratic representatives introduced a resolution in July encouraging all Ohio schools to retire their Native American mascots. Brendan Simmons details that continued push for change.
Some say it's a piece of history, the old Indian sign coming down, making way for the new Guardians name Cleveland's Major League Baseball team will take on, a move sought by Native Americans for years. The change was praised by the Lake Erie Native American Council in July. But even then, the group called on 200 schools across Ohio with offensive mascots to follow suit.
There is a lot more work that needs to be done. It's just the tip of the iceberg.
Chris Begay is chair of the Committee of 500 Years of Dignity and Resistance. He believes more changes are coming.
Most communities are acknowledging that, that it's time. It's time to move forward. It's time to let go.
Some examples, Copley High School's teams are known as the Indians. In 2020, students there held protests calling for a name change, also requesting more diversity initiatives take place in the district. In Parma, where the senior high school team is known as the Redmen, there have been public debates about making a switch. A majority of people at a 2020 virtual meeting supporting something new.
It's very embarrassing to have to say that that's your mascot for your high school.
It is a description based on skin color and gender. That is not honor, that is dehumanization.
So far, the team names and mascots in those 2 districts are still intact. Copley's superintendent says its diversity committee will review the topic in the near future, but a change likely won't happen this year. Discussions continue in Parma as well. But hope isn't lost. Begay says the fact that conversations of change are happening is progress.
For years, me growing up being part of this movement, there were so many times where it wasn't that way. And that is really good to hear and see.
For A Turning Point, I'm Brandon Simmons, 3 News.
Recognizing the past, the university that is expanding the practice of acknowledging the land we now use as belonging to Indigenous peoples. When A Turning Point continues. Welcome back. A dark past in the lives of Native Americans in North America has recently been uncovered, and it's drawing renewed focus on the horrific history of Native American boarding schools here in the U.S. It's a painful part of American history that often goes untold. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the U.S. established federally funded boarding schools aimed at assimilating hundreds of thousands of Native American children, forcibly taking them from their families and stripping them of their culture.
There was a lot of horrific things that happened to myself, and I know a lot of other individuals that were in that school system.
The horrors laid bare with the discovery last June of 215 unmarked graves outside of an Indigenous children's school in Canada, which had adopted similar policies as the U.S.
We talked when we were in school about some people that went missing, and it was assumed that they ran away and we're never going to come back.
My mother is a boarding school survivor.
Kent State adjunct professor Kimberly Medicine Horn Jackson is now part of a research team tasked with uncovering the horrific histories at these schools in the U.S.
And we're running against time. Our elders who went to the boarding schools, they're crossing over daily. And we're losing the truth of what happened.
There were 357 known boarding schools, many operated by Catholic and Protestant churches. Here, Native children were forced to abandon their language, their traditions, and culture. In this 1929 film, Native American children at a school in Arizona sing a nursery song originally written about counting dead Indians. The students' long hair, culturally a point of pride, was cut into short, uniform bowl haircuts. Was this ethnic cleansing?
According to the Geneva Convention on Genocide, the Native American boarding schools fall into all 10 categories of genocide.
But now, leading the way in the top levels of government.
Now, for the first time, this country has a cabinet secretary who is Indigenous. I come from ancestors who endured the horrors of Indian boarding school assimilation policies carried out by the same department that I now lead.
Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland launched the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative to investigate the full scope of U.S. policies and their effects.
The removal of history in our books, that's a method of Indian removal.
Speaking the untold truth, only until then can healing begin.
How can we ever heal? How can we ever do things differently if we don't take the time to listen to what happened?
You know, many of us know the colonization myth that we learned in school.
Yes, in 1492, when Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, what he discovered, though, was not a new world. It was one inhabited by millions of indigenous people.
Land acknowledgement is a practice growing in popularity across the country. An increasing number of institutions and groups are beginning events with a statement recognizing that they are gathering on land that once belonged to Native Americans.
The City Club of Cleveland sometimes begins meetings with a land acknowledgement, and so does the Gun Foundation here in Cleveland. Jasmine Monroe shows us how The Ohio State University is hoping to take land acknowledgements one step further.
Cheke mitoseniake, alime mekulendangeke, The Ohio State University, eteke akishakonge, ehe wiakiange, miamiake, shawanuki, wahunahake, wapanakiake, pewaliake, latoake, pasikaniake, achipwiake, katuake.
For the past year, the university has been working towards making reparations to indigenous tribes affected by the loss of land. A report from High Country News, land grab universities expose the history of land-grant institutions founded by the Morrill Act of 1862. Profits from the sale of indigenous land were used to create OSU's campus.
As the saying goes, for all marginalized people, right, all oppressed peoples, is that it's not about us without us.
John Lau is the associate professor at OSU who works on a team helping to make land acknowledgements more actionable.
We're asking Indians. We're reaching out to Indian peoples. We're taking surveys and interviews, and we're having. So we want to ask the Indians. There's probably more than 100 tribes with some kind of connection to Ohio State.
So far, $230,000 have been awarded to the land acknowledgement team in internal grants. Molly Rambo is a Native American from Berea and a student at OSU, and she believes more needs to be done.
For us being the third largest land grant university and having that much acreage, you would think the university would step forward and do more. What is that money being used for? It was Native land. Why don't we have more programs, or why don't we have more educators, Native educators, or even Native individuals in spots of higher position?
And although Native students make up less than 0.1% of the population on campus, Lau and Rambo say it's time for Indigenous people to receive recognition.
We're just asking for basic human decency and for what is ours back. And at the very least, that's what we deserve. Be more than an ally. Just don't say you're there for us. Be there for us. We are still here. My culture is not dead.
For Turning Point, I'm Jasmine Monroe.
Next up, a season of change, the push behind putting an end to one holiday when we return.
Welcome back to this special edition of Front Row, A Turning Point. In Northeast Ohio, there have been two popular topics of conversation surrounding Native American culture we see year after year: the name of Cleveland's baseball team and Columbus Day. Now, Russ Mitchell reports.
We're not mascots. Our children are not mascots, and it's racist. It's time to move on.
It's been more than 60 years in the making. We are now preparing to witness a season of change.
Today is officially the last game that we will talk about, this being the Cleveland Indians.
It's the changing of the guard at Progressive Field. Our baseball franchise, officially the Cleveland Guardians. For Native groups like the Lake Erie Native American Council and Committee of 500 Years, it's been a long time coming.
There were ups and downs, and there were times where we were told that we're wasting our time. But that never stopped us.
Now, the focus of change shifts to a national holiday. Josh Hunt, with Committee of 500 Years, wants Columbus Day celebrations to end.
It's a reminder of that painful genocidal history. And it's a reminder that many people, including young people, children, are taught a lie about the history of this country.
He and others would rather see Indigenous people celebrations take hold instead, celebrating Native Americans who were here before Columbus. It's a movement that's growing fast. Despite Columbus Day having federal holiday designation, President Biden signed a proclamation declaring Indigenous Peoples Day for the first time.
That was Russ Mitchell reporting. Coming up, we will hear from some Northeast Ohio's Native American population on representation and inclusivity.
Natural history museums and saying I'm Native, like this diorama full of Native people, and my classmate telling me that you can't be Indian, Indians are extinct.
Welcome back. Last Tuesday night, Mark Namick sat down to have a conversation with Native Americans making a difference in our community.
And here's a snippet of that conversation.
Not all of us come from the same places, but that our experiences now living in Cleveland, we do have things in common, and that our world is constantly changing, and many of our families are multiracial and multi-ethnic, and some of us, we still very much identify with our Native traditions and our culture. And this community is very supportive in that also, that it is inclusive of all of our folks' descendants.
When I first came to Ohio, it was a little bit of a culture shock going to Ohio State and just not having a large Native community. So I quickly found that one of the most important things is creating that Native community for me to be able to be successful.
Being Native American is such a huge diaspora of people, even though there are very pan-Indian, or I guess across the spectrum, things like powwows and things that are universal to tribes. There are things that do make us different. We're all part of sovereign nations. And so I think for me, the biggest thing is representation.
Be purposeful about including who we are as a modern people in their day-to-day lives. I think something like 87% of state history standards in this country fail to talk about Native Americans after the year 1900. And it's, that's how you get like little kids like me going to natural history museums and saying I'm Native, like this diorama full of Native people, and my classmate telling me that you can't be Indian, Indians are extinct. So I'm really challenging people to kind of, push the mold, start, reflecting on the land you're standing on, and also realizing that we're still here today.
Such important perspectives, and we are so grateful to share them tonight. Thank you. You can find that full conversation on WKYC.com under the Turning Point page on our website. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Yeah, we hope you learned something tonight. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.